So today we all heard the news about the US and Israel jointly attacking, bombing Iran, more than 20 cities, I believe. Now let's talk about the Middle East regime change attempts over the years, the Middle East imbroglio, and the power projection adventures in the last 70 some years. Now, today's attempt to get rid of the Iranian regime by the US and Israel is the latest attempt in a series of skirmishes and wars in the Middle East in the last 70 years. Now, different alliances and power consolidation attempts, different power projection equations have come and gone, and the results have been neither impressive nor even anything to crow about. Most people don't even know about the initial attempts by the U.S. To get its foot through the door after the British in Iran. And most people do not even know about the initial attempts by the Arab nationalists under the Bathist era, when Syria and Egypt even joined together to form a combined Arab nationalist nation. That experiment did not last long. Most Americans cannot even pronounce the word Iran. This is Iran and Iraq and whatever. They have trouble finding it on a map, I believe. So let alone know why it is whatever it is today. But American interventions in the Middle East and influence peddling has been the hallmark of US foreign policy, at least in the last 50 to 70 years. The monarchies of the Middle East owe the survival to the USA, even as they tried to have a facade of anti-Americanism once in a while for domestic consumption often. And regime changes instigated by the USA has been instrumental for a long time for the instability in the Middle East. The Mossadegh government of Iran, overthrown by the CIA and the British intelligence, those activities were to install the puppet regime of the Shah Reza Pahlavi. Libya's Gaddafi tried to curry favors with the West by giving up his nuclear ambitions, and that proved to be very costly, a fatefully stupid decision, much like Ukraine's stupid decision to give up its nukes after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Anyway, and those things do matter. But depending upon the USA in the Middle East has not always been helpful to some of the local tribes or militia in the Middle East. The Kurds over the last 75 years have on and off helped the USA in its Middle East policies, but have never really had the benefits thereof. Now, the West has attempted regime changes also in the form of the Arab Spring, but the Middle East monarchies survived. However, a similar color revolution, remember the color revolutions? Remember Victoria Noland? Anyway, in Ukraine, ended up overthrowing the pro Russian regime and pissing off Putin along the way. And here we are 13 years later after the color revolution. Something similar happened in, I guess, Georgia, but they have a semblance of a certain so called democracy in Georgia by now, thanks to the color revolution. Anyway, so the Russians had moved in after the US bailed out of the Middle East for a while, a decade ago, especially after the fruitless military actions in Iraq, only to have the pro Iranian factions take over when the US left. Now, the US, with the help of ISIS type of killers, got rid of the Russians in the Middle East from Syria in the last few years, with President Trump even hosting the previous ISIS affiliated, Al Qaeda affiliated killers in Washington, D.C. recently. Now, China and Russia have tried to prop up the Iranian regime in response, only to have Israel and the US now try another regime change today in Iran. To summarize, US regime changes attempts have been in 2026, that's today, following a failed diplomatic process and a 12-day war in June 2025. We have this US starting a massive military operation to destroy the Iranian missile programs and remove the current leadership. Now, remember Iraq 2003? Well, we had even President George Bush, declare victory prematurely on a ship. Anyway, Iraq 2003, US led invasion toppled Saddam Hussein based on claims of weapons of mass destruction and falsely all the links to Al Qaeda, which proved to be just made up. Afghanistan 2001, we remember that ousted the Taliban regime after 9/11, probably justified, but stayed for 20 more years trying to clean up the mess and failed. Now, let's not forget like I mentioned, the U.S. regime change attempt during Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, the Anglo-American experiment, the coup, Syria 49 to 50s. CIA supported multiple military coups there to counter the communists, presumably. And Iraq, of course, the CIA provided intelligence to the Ba'ath Party, which was used to target, eliminate communists, and so on. The so-called Saddam Hussein was one of the Baathists, actually. Remember him? Which he went to fight with in later in the end of the 2000 decade. Anyway, other examples include efforts or advocacy for intervening in Syria, Libya, and all of that in the Middle East. So let us see if the latest regime change attempt works or works better. One more important issue about the Middle East geopolitics is that of alliances, shifting sands. Friends and allies today and often end up on different sides pretty soon, a decade later. Turkey and Israel have been close for a long time, 20 years, I guess, even as they feud. But the new Saudi plus Turkey plus Pakistan alliance now is forming as we speak today. It seems to be anti-Israel, anti-India for sure, and maybe anti-West. New alliance coming up here. Again, they're likely to be countered by another new alliance of Israel, United Arab Emirates, and India, for example, and maybe a few more countries thrown in. Now, this new formations, where does that leave China and Russia? They try to prop up Iran, and then let's see if they even succeeded, even at a small level, to provide a better defensive armaments to Iran. It doesn't seem like it worked. Anyway, so during the what should I say, draw post World War, First World War, Saudis and U.S. and Turkey plus the hapless Kurds during the after the Gulf War, the Saudis, U.S. and Turkey and the Kurds got together to fight against Russia and its presence in the Middle East, namely in Syria, especially in Syria. Again, the Kurds didn't get anything out of that. They got bashed around by everybody, and recently they had to settle with Turkey. So much for helping the US out. You got to be careful. Now, Russia has no foothold in the Middle East and seems to want to come back via Iran, but I'm not sure if they'll make any headway at this point. Egypt and Israel have been close for a long time in the Middle East, along with Jordan, and all three get tons of money from the USA. That seems to work to keep them together. Will Egypt join the Saudis and the Turkeys next, the Sunni brothers? That's going to be interesting. Qatar has always been close to Iran, for example, and the Hamas too, funding everybody. And Al Jazeera gave them a lot of airtime. But then, surprisingly or not so surprisingly, they host the US bases in the Middle East. It's hilarious, isn't it? These kind of relationships. Anyway, shifting sands of alliances in the Middle East will continue to change its shape regularly, and power projection by the USA and its allies of the day succeeds or fails over a few years. So there will be no such thing as peace in the Middle East for quite some time to come. Here is the irony. President Trump, who spoke about peace, has now bombed Iran into smithereens. Well, that's peace for him, peace of the graveyard, I suspect. Anyway, let us see how the world recovers from this. Hopefully, this phase of conflict will be short-lived. Will come to an end soon for the betterment of mankind.